The thing I think about most, when I let myself think about it, is the pencil. Not the Vreth, not the station, not the sound they made when they breached the outer wall, that low harmonic that you felt in your molars before you heard it with your ears, the frequency they used to map enclosed spaces, 300 meters of swept tone that bounces off every surface and comes back to them as a perfect architectural model of whatever room you're hiding in. I've tried to describe it to people who weren't there, and the best I've managed is this. Imagine someone running a wet finger around the rim of a very large glass, and then imagine that glass is the building you're standing inside. That's the Vreth mapping pulse. One pass, and they know where every corridor goes, every door, every person standing still behind every wall. It's not a weapon, it is simply how they see. But I don't think about that first. I think about the pencil. Specifically, I think about whoever held it, an engineer I never met, working a relay housing I only found by accident in a maintenance bay on a forward station that most people have never heard of, and I think about what moved them to do what they did. Not duty. There was no duty in it. There was no audience. There was no form to fill out, no certification to complete, no supervisor watching over their shoulder. There was no requirement in any regulation I have ever read that says, when you figure out the torque sequence on a warped coupling seat, write it on the inside of the cover so the next person finds it. There is no rule like that. There never has been. The person who wrote those numbers did it because they had learned something the hard way, and they had looked at the empty face of that cover panel, and they had thought, the next person will need to know this. That's the thing I think about. The pencil and the decision to use it. My name is Tolan Varis. I spent 22 years as a field systems engineer with the Karath Defense Directorate, most of them on forward stations, the kind that get built fast and maintained reluctantly, because the assumption is always that they will be obsolete before they decay. I retired with a partial left-hand tremor from a pressure seal rupture in my third year, a brief, stupid accident involving a wrench, a coupling that was older than my career, and the particular overconfidence of a 29-year-old who had been on the job long enough to stop being careful and not long enough to know what that costs, and a set of opinions about maintenance culture that most of my supervisors found exhausting. I am 52 now. I live in a quiet place. I grow things. I think about the pencil. Let me tell you about Karath Station, and the day the Vreth came, and the 7 marks on the inside of the cover. Karath Forward Station, the proper designation was KFS-7, Karath Tactical Node 7, though nobody called it that, was a mid-size installation on the edge of what the Directorate called the Veth Corridor. A belt of contested survey space, about 11 light-minutes wide, that neither the Human Compact nor the Vreth propagation had formally claimed, because formally claiming it would have meant formally acknowledging the other party's right to reject that claim, and both sides had treaty lawyers who were very good at finding reasons to table things. The Veth Corridor had been tabled for going on 19 years when I arrived at KFS-7. That's a long time for a place nobody owns. The station had been built in stages, the way most forward stations are built, with ambition at the beginning and practicality halfway through, and compromise at the end, and then years of accumulated workarounds laid on top of the whole thing like geological strata. The first stage had been a survey platform, 8 modules, pressurized corridors connecting them like the spokes of a wheel laid flat, everything rated for survey-class operations, and nothing rated for anything more demanding than that. The second stage had been a tactical overlay, additional modules grafted onto the original frame when the Directorate decided it wanted a military presence in the corridor, which happened after the Vreth established their own forward position about 8 light-minutes out, and everyone stopped pretending the tabling was going to hold indefinitely. The tactical overlay had been designed by different engineers than the original platform, working from a different set of assumptions, and the junction points between the 2 stages were the kind of thing that keeps maintenance engineers awake at night. The third stage was the maintenance complex, 3 full-size hangars with hard dock capability and workshop space, built to service the patrol craft that used KFS-7 as a turnaround point. Hangar 3 was the largest and the newest, added in the station's 8th year when patrol traffic had exceeded the capacity of the original 2 hangars. It had been designed quickly, built quickly, and certified on a timeline that would not have survived scrutiny if anyone had looked too closely at the junction between Hangar 3 and the station's existing pressure spine. Nobody had looked too closely. The hangar had been there for 3 years when I arrived, and in those 3 years it had not fallen down, which was the primary metric the Directorate used to assess structural integrity. I arrived at KFS-7 with the rank of Senior Technician and the explicit assignment of assessing the maintenance complex's long-term structural viability. The short version of my findings, which I submitted to the Directorate 6 weeks after I arrived, was, it wasn't. The long version ran to 43 pages and included a prioritized remediation schedule broken into 3 tiers. Priority 1 for items likely to cause immediate failure under normal operating load. Priority 2 for items likely to cause failure under emergency or surge conditions. And Priority 3 for items that needed to be addressed within 2 years to prevent progression to higher priority. And a note in the executive summary that if the Priority 2 items were not addressed and a significant structural load event occurred in Hangar 3, we would lose the hangar. The Directorate acknowledged receipt of my report. They funded the Priority 1 items, which was better than I had expected. They did not fund the Priority 2 items, citing the upcoming budget cycle review. The cycle review was scheduled for 4 months later. When it came, they funded approximately 40% of the Priority 2 items I had flagged, with the remaining 60% deferred to the following cycle. That cycle never came, or rather it came and the funding went elsewhere, and the 60% remained unfunded, and the Priority 2 status of those items quietly slid toward Priority 1 as the months went on and the loads accumulated. I stayed anyway. I stayed because the work was real, and because forward stations have a particular quality that is hard to explain to anyone who hasn't lived on one. A combination of isolation and consequence that focuses the mind in ways that comfortable postings do not. On a forward station, what you fix stays fixed, or it doesn't, and you find out quickly which it is. There is no distance between the work and the result. I find I am constitutionally suited to that kind of clarity, even when the clarity is uncomfortable. I stayed and I kept working, and I kept documenting. I documented in 3 places: the official record, a personal log I kept on a hardened drive in my bunk, and when the repair or the workaround was small enough and local enough that the only person likely to ever need it was whoever came after me inside the equipment itself. A note, a line, sometimes just a number or a symbol, penciled on an interior surface where the next set of hands to open it would see it immediately. Not hidden, not coded. Exactly where they would look first, because a person opening a housing cover always looks at the inside face of the cover before they look at the equipment itself, because the cover is the first thing they see. I did not invent this practice. Every serious engineer I had learned from did it, and they had learned it from the engineers before them. And the chain went back, I am convinced, to the very first human who fastened something shut and understood that the inside face of the thing they had fastened would be read before the outside of the thing they had built. My first trainer, a woman named Cass Alverne who had 30 years on deep stations and knuckles like rivets and an absolute refusal to explain anything more than once, told me on my first week that the inside of a housing cover was the most reliable message-passing medium in the known universe. Log systems got wiped. Maintenance records got lost in transitions between posting cycles. Reports got filed and acknowledged and deferred and revised until the original problem they described was unrecognizable. But a pencil mark on the inside of a cover would outlast the station. It would be read by whoever opened the housing, directly, with no intermediary, no system to fail, no chain of custody to break. She showed me marks she had found, 20 years worth of them documented in a personal log she kept in a small notebook, not a digital log, a paper notebook, another habit she had taken from her own trainers. Notes, sequences, warnings, the occasional name. One mark in particular I remember. A single diagonal line with a small circle at its upper end, scratched into the interior face of a junction cover on a deep survey vessel, which Cass had eventually decoded as a reminder that the junction's secondary ground was reversed, that whoever had wired it had made the connections backwards, that the junction functioned correctly despite this because of a compensating error downstream, and that if you corrected the reversal without also correcting the downstream error, you would introduce a fault. Someone had found this out, had understood that any future engineer working the junction would make the same correction and create the same fault, and had left the mark. Cass had found it 40 years after it was made. She had been grateful. She showed me another, a small circled number 3 with 2 tick marks beside it, found on the inside face of a pump housing cover on a mid-range transport. She had puzzled over it for 2 days before realizing it was a runtime indicator. The pump had been rebuilt twice, the number marking the rebuild count, and the tick marks indicating that after the third rebuild the impeller clearance needed to be set 3/10 tighter than the manufacturer's spec, because the housing bore had grown slightly from the accumulated heat cycles of the first 2 rebuilds. The manufacturer's spec was correct for a new housing. It was wrong for a housing that had been through what this one had been through. Someone had learned this, and they had left the correction where it could be found, and Casso had found it, and the pump had run correctly for another 6 years before the transport was decommissioned. She had asked around carefully over several years, and never found anyone who knew who had written it. That was the third lesson, the one she saved for last. You will almost certainly never find out who wrote the mark, and it doesn't matter. The mark is not about credit. It is not about the person who wrote it. It is about the person who will read it, who is coming after you, who you will never meet, who needs to know this specific thing that you have learned in this specific place. You write it for them. You write it in the most durable, most direct, most unmediated way available to you, and then you close the panel and you move on. The mark does its work without you. That is the design. That habit is why I am not alive. Or more precisely, that habit passed from engineers I never met to Cass, Vern to me, and then from me to the inside of the Hangar 3 pressure relay housing, and from there to Dale Forst and Pyan Noor and 15 other people who walked through a secondary airlock to safety, is why 21 other people are alive. I am not alive, and I am at peace with that, or as close to peace as I can honestly claim to be. But that is a different part of the story. The Vreth propagation began their move on the Veth corridor on what my logs recorded as day 847 of my posting, a Tuesday late afternoon. The first indication was a high-frequency seismic event in the station's outer hull sensors, not an impact, not a pressure wave, but a resonance, as if someone had struck a tuning fork the size of a moon and held it against the station's skin. The duty officer in operations called it a gravitational anomaly and logged it as a possible instrument fault. In the context of KFS-7's sensor maintenance history, that was a reasonable assessment. Our outer hull sensors had been flagging false positives intermittently for 8 months due to a firmware issue that was itself on the unfunded portion of the remediation list. I was in Hangar 3 at the time, 70 feet up on a scaffold, doing an inspection of the overhead tether rail system that had been flagged in my report as Priority 2, meaning someone would get to it eventually. I had gotten to it myself because tether rails were one of those systems that looked fine right up until they catastrophically weren't, and because I had run a load calculation 2 weeks earlier that suggested the north section of the rail was closer to its fatigue limit than any of the maintenance logs suggested. I was making notes. The scaffold was a good place to work. You could see the whole hangar from up there, the dock floor below with the 3 patrol craft in their service bays, The cable runs overhead, the workshop space at the north end, the utility alcove housing the south relay off to the right. I had developed the habit of doing full hangar visual checks whenever I was elevated. You see things from height that you miss at ground level. I felt the resonance through the scaffold before I heard the alarm. The scaffold was welded to the station frame at 6 attachment points. The vibration ran up through my feet, through my knees, into my chest. A low, deep pulse that wasn't quite a sound and wasn't quite a physical shock, but was something in between. Something that suggested very large mass moving in coordinated ways. I recognized it from the briefings. We had all been briefed on what to expect if the Vreth moved into active propagation, and the briefings had included audio recordings of their mapping pulse from prior contacts, scaled down to safe playback levels. Those recordings had not done it justice, because the recordings were of the sound, and the sound was only part of it. The pulse was also pressure, and heat, and the particular subjective experience of knowing that the thing making that sound was rebuilding its model of every room you had ever occupied, simultaneously, from 300 meters out. I came down the scaffold fast. I was halfway down the second section when the outer bay doors blew. Not in. The doors didn't implode. The Vreth were not interested in breaching the structure, not yet. The doors blew out, or more precisely, the hydraulic actuators that held them sealed failed simultaneously across all 12 locking points, because the mapping pulse had found the resonant frequency of the actuator housings and held it for 4.2 seconds, which was long enough to fatigue the seals on the hydraulic lines feeding the actuators. And once those seals failed, the actuators lost pressure, and without hydraulic pressure, the doors unsealed themselves. I learned that specific mechanism from the incident analysis conducted 6 months later. In the moment, what I knew was that the hangar doors were open, the alarm was going, and afternoon light was flooding in through the gap in a way that felt wrong, too much light, too suddenly, from a direction that had always been sealed. It is a strange and specific wrongness, that sudden rectangle of sky where there had been a wall. I hit the deck at the bottom of the scaffold ladder and stayed low until I had my orientation. From the bay floor, prone on the deck plates, looking through the gap in the doors, I could see the corridor. I could see the Vreth. The Vreth propagation is not a military force in any sense the word holds meaning for us. They do not have soldiers. They have what their interpreters call the Vethnau, which translates approximately as the portion that moves ahead. And the Vethnau is composed of biological units, individual organisms, each one alive and capable of independent action at the local level, but organized at a collective level so tightly that describing them as individuals is almost a courtesy. The collective coordination happens at speeds that our neuroscience doesn't fully account for. The working model, last I heard, was that the Vreth communicate through a combination of low-frequency vibration and a class of airborne biochemicals that work at very short ranges, such that each unit is simultaneously receiving information from every unit within about 6 meters of it, and each of those units from every unit within 6 meters of them, and so on outward through the formation. The result is a mass that has the responsiveness of a single organism at any scale you care to measure. What I saw through the gap in the bay doors was the leading edge of the Vethnau. I counted habit, engineers count things, and estimated approximately 300,000 units in the visible formation, which was itself only the forward point of a larger propagation body moving through the corridor. Later analysis put the total Vethnau engagement at just over 4 million units. 300,000 was what I could see from the bay floor, looking out through a gap about 6 meters wide and 3 meters tall, across roughly 400 meters of open ground between the station's outer hull and the leading formation edge. They were moving at about walking pace, smooth. Layered, the formation was three-dimensional, taller at the center and tapering at the flanks, the way a wave is taller at its peak. The individual units were visible from that distance as a kind of texture on the surface of the formation, irregular and dense, like a field of something growing very fast, except that the field was moving toward me at walking pace across 400 meters of open ground, and the particular quality of its motion, the absolute evenness of it, no variation in speed, no deviation in direction, the way water moves when there is no obstacle to force a choice, was the most frightening thing I have ever seen. I have tried to explain this to people who weren't there, and the explanation always falls short, because the fear was not rational and is difficult to convey in rational language. It was the fear of something that had no doubt. Something that was not advancing toward a goal but simply encompassing space, the way the tide encompasses the shore, without decision, without effort, without the possibility of a different outcome. The alarm had been going for about 40 seconds. I had to move. I did a fast count of people in the bay. The hangar had been moderately staffed, not a full crew. It was Tuesday afternoon, and I identified 14 others besides myself. 3 mechanics working a scheduled service on the patrol craft in Bay 1, 4 general maintenance staff stringing cable through the overhead duct system above Bay 2, 2 dock coordinators at the bay control station on the east wall, and 3 technical specialists in the small precision workshop off the north end, running calibrations on sensor packages. 15 people counting me, a good number for a Tuesday. The first thing I did was pull the manual close on the blast partition, a secondary barrier on the inside of the main door line, 12 composite panels on pivoting mounts, rated for pressure events up to a certain threshold, operable by hand if the primary hydraulics failed. The design assumption was that anyone needing to close the partition manually would have at least several minutes to do it. The process required swinging each panel on its pivot and latching it to the next, and 12 panels was not fast work. I had 4 minutes, possibly 5. 2 of the mechanics, I learned their names properly afterward, though I knew them by sight. Dale Forst and Pioneer, both solid, both the kind of people who move toward a problem rather than away from it, were beside me before I had the first panel moving. We split the work. Dale took the upper latches, I took the lower. Pion handled the pivot pressure on the heavy middle panels that wanted to swing wide. We got all 12 latched in just under 4 minutes. The bay was sealed. Not sealed in any sense that would hold indefinitely. I knew the gaps at the lower corners. They were in my report, Priority 2, unfunded. I had them memorized the way you memorize the things that might kill you. The gaps were about 4 centimeters at the lower left and 3.5 at the lower right, where the partition base didn't fully meet the deck plate due to the deck settlement I had also documented. 4 centimeters and 3.5 centimeters. Not large. The Vreth individual unit was roughly the size and general shape of a human hand. 4 centimeters was not enough for a unit to pass through. It was enough for a unit to exert pressure, and given time and numbers, to widen. I had time, but not unlimited time. The emergency lights overhead gave everything a flat, greenish-white cast, the particular quality of emergency illumination that strips color from faces and makes distance hard to judge. 14 people around me, all of them looking at me, which I understood. I was the most senior technical authority in the bay. I had been here the longest, and in the absence of command presence, people look at whoever seems to know the building best. I did know the building best. I also knew, without saying it, that the blast partition was not the primary problem. "Is it holding?" one of the dock coordinators asked. Her name, I would learn later, was Enith Sola. She was 24 years old, 3 months at KFS 7, 2 years in the directorate, one of those people who asks the right question at the right moment without knowing that it's the right question. It steadied the room, that question. It gave everyone something to focus on instead of the low pressure sound that was building again outside the partition. Not the full mapping pulse, just the leading edge of the next sweep, probing for gaps. "For now," I said, "here's what we have." I told them what I needed them to know. Not everything, not the coupling, not yet, because naming the problem before I knew if I could solve it would have used time and produced fear without output. I told them about the secondary airlock on the south wall, which connected through a pressurized passage to the station's interior spine corridor. I told them the passage was sound. I had assessed it myself. It was not on any priority list. It was built properly and had stayed that way. I told them the airlock operated on the relay system in the south utility alcove, and that I needed to check the relay status before I could say anything more. I told the dock coordinators to get everyone organized by the secondary airlock, 2 at a time, and to have the manifest list ready. Then I went to the alcove. The south relay was a 3-meter cabinet, the kind of installation that has been in place long enough to accumulate layers of modification, original equipment, replacement components, field repairs, improvised solutions to problems that weren't anticipated in the original design. The cabinet was functional. Most of what was in it worked. The thing that did not work, or rather the thing that was 3 days from not working, was the pressure coupling on the main power trunk, the fitting that mated the heavy-duty conduit from the primary bus to the relay housing. I had found this coupling during a routine inspection 3 days earlier. I had flagged it. I had called in a replacement order. Supply had confirmed receipt and estimated 14 days for delivery. I had noted in my personal log that the coupling was at approximately 60% of specification on thread engagement, was stable under normal operating load, and would need to be watched. I had not flagged it as an emergency because at 60% on normal load it was not an emergency. It was a managed item, a known quantity, a thing I was tracking. Under emergency surge load, it was a different quantity entirely. I looked at the coupling now in the flat emergency light of the alcove, and I tried to run the numbers in my head. Emergency cycle speed on the secondary airlock, 2 people per cycle, roughly 90 seconds from seal to seal. 8 cycles to get 15 people through. 12 minutes of surge loading with the peaks at each cycle transition. The sealing wrap in the parts bin, the spring rings that were the wrong size for this fitting but close enough to be useful. A jury rig. A marginal jury rig, the kind that held under one set of assumptions and failed under another, and the key question was which set of assumptions was actually true. I had done more with less. Every engineer who has worked forward stations long enough has done more with less. The question is not whether you can improve the odds, you always can, but whether the improvement is enough, and the only way to know is to do the calculation honestly and not lie to yourself about what the numbers say. I ran the calculation. The sealing wrap plus the spring rings, correctly applied, would bring the jury-rigged coupling to somewhere between 65 and 75% of specification. The uncertainty in that range was not engineering imprecision. I can calculate tolerances to 1/10 of a millimeter, but uncertainty about the condition of the seat itself, which I could not assess without looking at it from the inside. I opened the relay housing cover to assess the seat from the interior. The cover was a standard panel, about 40 centimeters square, hinged at the top, latched at the bottom with a single T-handle fastener. I unlatched it and swung it open on its hinges. On the inside face of the cover, the face that pointed inward when the panel was closed, which was never visible during normal operations, never visible at all unless someone opened the housing. Someone had written in soft pencil, in small, neat, careful numbers, 1426357. Below the numbers, also in pencil, much smaller, almost an afterthought, the way you add a note when you realize the numbers alone might not be enough. Warp sequence, tighten in this order, or she'll crack the seat. That was all. No name, no date. No job number, no certification stamp, no reference to any work order or maintenance log or official record of any kind. Just the sequence, and the 9 words that explained what the sequence was for. I stood there for a moment. The alarm was still going. Through the blast partition behind me, I could feel the third mapping pulse beginning its sweep. a change in the pressure of the air, subtle but unmistakable once you had felt it once, the particular quality of resonance that means the Vreth are rebuilding their model of the space you're standing in. I stood there, and I looked at the 7 numbers, and I thought about Cas Auvergne. The coupling on this fitting had 7 discrete thread engagement points, 7 specific positions around the circumference of the fitting body where the sealing pressure was applied when you torqued the coupling down. Standard procedure was circular. Position 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, around the clock face of the fitting, even pressure in sequence, the way you torque a wheel or a flange or any other circular fastener. Every apprentice learned it that way. The textbook said it that way. It was correct procedure for a true seat. The seat in this relay housing was not true. I could see it now, looking at it from the inside with the cover open and the emergency light in the alcove giving me a harsh, flat view of the fitting face. 11 years of thermal cycling. The hangar ran hot when the dock systems were full load, cold when they were offline. The delta, sometimes 30 or 40 degrees across a single day, had introduced a slight warp into the seat flange, a fraction of a millimeter. The high side of the warp was at approximately the 4 o'clock position on the fitting face. The low side was opposite, at 10 o'clock. On a true seat, standard circular torque sequence applied even sealing pressure across the full circumference and closed the fitting properly. On a warped seat, standard circular torque sequence drew the low side down first, and when you got around to the high side, the fitting had already been rotating on the fulcrum of the low side's engagement, and by the time you torqued the high side down, the seat on the low side had already begun to compress unevenly, and the result, under high load, under surge, was a microfracture pattern at the worst possible point in the engagement, the point where the compression was unevenly applied. Someone had figured this out. Someone had looked at the cracked seat, or the near miss, or had run the analysis I was running now but with a longer timeline and more data points, and had understood. On this specific fitting in this specific housing, the standard sequence fails. The correct sequence starts at 4 at the high side of the warp, draws the fitting face down onto the high point first, then works across to the opposite side, then around in the order that maintains even contact pressure despite the uneven seat surface. 1426357, not circular. Opposed pairs, stepping across the warp rather than working around it, pulling everything true from the worst point first. Someone had written it down inside the cover, where I could find it. I called Dale and Pyan to the alcove. I showed them the numbers. I explained what we were doing and why and what I needed from each of them. We worked with the fast, quiet efficiency that good maintenance teams develop, not rushing, not wasting motion, each person doing their part without narration because narration uses time, and when the work is right you don't need narration. Pyan ran the sealing wrap. 3 layers, overlapping at each pass as tight as she could draw it by hand. The sealing wrap was rated for static pressure retention. What we were asking of it was not quite static, but it was the best material available. Dale set the spring rings over the wrap, one near the top of the engagement zone and one near the bottom, pressing them into position with his thumbs, holding them while I started the coupling body onto the fitting. The coupling threaded on smoothly. That was good. It meant the thread engagement zone was clean. No debris, no corrosion. The wrap and rings were compressing properly underneath. I felt it seat against the wrap at about 4 threads of engagement, which was where I had expected it. Then I picked up the torque wrench. Position 1. The 4 o'clock point on the fitting face, the high side of the warp, the side where the gap between fitting face and seat flange was widest, not where any apprentice would start, not where standard procedure would start. I put the wrench on it and applied torque steadily, feeling for the point at which the fitting face contacted the seat through the compressed sealing wrap, and at that point I held the torque and moved to position 4. Position 4. The 10 o'clock point, directly opposite 1. The far side of the warp, the low side, the side that had always closed first in the standard sequence and had been causing the problem. Opposed. drawing both sides of the warp toward the seat simultaneously, the wrap compressing evenly on both sides, neither side getting ahead of the other. I said to Payan, "Watch the coupling face, tell me if you see it walking." She leaned in. "Not walking," she said, "settling even." Position 2. Adjacent to 1, clockwise 1 step around the high side arc. The fitting face was moving now, settling into the seat, the wrap compressing into the gaps left by the warp and filling them. I could feel through the wrench the difference between a fitting that was seating true and one that was rocking on a fulcrum. This was seating true. The sequence was working. Position 6. The mirror of 2 on the low side arc. The fitting face continued down, even on both sides now, the warp becoming irrelevant as the sealing wrap filled the gap and the compression equalized. Position 3. Halfway around the high side arc between positions 2 and 4. The torque reading was increasing, real resistance now, the kind that meant the fitting was down against the seat, and the remaining torque was compressing the seal rather than just closing the gap. I had been watching the spring rings. They were holding their compression, the wrong size rings doing a reasonable job of what right size rings would have done better. Position 5. The mirror of 3. Payan said quietly, "She's seated. I can see it." She meant that the fitting face was now flush with the seat flange on both sides, the warp compensated, the wrap visible at the edge as a thin line of compressed material, the spring rings flat and even. Position 7. Last position. I applied the full rated torque and held it for a count of 3, 1, 2, 3, the way Castleverne had taught me to count it, slow and deliberate, letting the fastener settle into the load before you declared it done. The coupling was seated. I looked at it for a moment. The jury rig showed its improvisation at the edges. The sealing wrap squeezed out slightly from under the spring rings. The spring rings themselves with the small irregularity of components being asked to do work they were not quite sized for. It was not beautiful. It was not what a properly replaced coupling with a matched replacement part, installed on a true seat with the correct tooling and the correct time, would have looked like. But the fitting was down against the seat, and the seat contact was even, and the engagement was tight, and that was what mattered. I called to the dock coordinators. "Start the cycling, 2 at a time, keep it steady, don't rush the seals." The workshop specialists went first, 3 of them 2 cycles. Then the cable crew, 4 of them 2 cycles. Then the 2 dock coordinators. Then the remaining mechanic who had not been helping with the partition or the coupling work. That was 8 cycles, 14 people. I told Dale and Payan to go with the last cycle of the main group. Dale looked at me. He had understood the math when I had run it for him, and he had understood the implication that someone needed to stay on this side of the airlock, monitoring the coupling, ready to throttle the draw on the airlock circuit manually if the coupling began to go on the last cycle, and needed every fractional bit of help it could get. He had understood that I was the person best suited to make that call, because I had the most detailed understanding of the coupling's condition and the sensitivity in my hands from 22 years of this work to feel through the housing what a gauge could not always show me. He looked at me and he knew. He was a good engineer. Good engineers understand the allocation of resources. "Varis," he said, not arguing, just saying my name. "Get them out," I said. "That's the job." He nodded once and he went. I want to be careful about what I say next, because I have thought about it for a long time, and I have no desire to make it into something it wasn't. I was not calm in the way that stories sometimes describe people as calm in moments like this, clear-eyed and certain, and at peace. I was focused, which is different. Focus is not peace. Focus is the narrowing of attention to what is in front of you, to the exclusion of everything else, because the everything else is where the fear lives, and fear uses time you don't have. I was focused on the coupling. I was focused on the sounds coming from the blast partition, the change in the quality of the sound at the lower left corner, the sound of something patient and methodical finding the gap and beginning to work it. I was focused on the airlock indicator light and the cycle count. I was not focused on what I knew, which was that I had 20 minutes, maybe less, and no route out. Cycle 1. The surge on the airlock circuit ran through the relay housing, and I felt it through my hand on the housing surface, not a vibration, more of a shift in the thermal character of the metal, the way loaded components run slightly warmer than idle ones. The coupling held. The sealing wrap was intact on all visible edges. The spring rings were holding compression. Cycle 2. The blast partition was moving at the lower left corner, not in any visible way, not structural, but the sound had changed again, a slight increase in the texture of it, the way a sound changes when it moves from one medium to another. I did not look. Looking would have told me nothing I didn't already know and would have used time and attention I needed elsewhere. Cycle 3. The surge was heavier on this cycle. The airlock had taken a load correction, adjusting for a pressure differential in the passage, which meant the draw on the relay circuit peaked slightly higher than the nominal. The coupling shuddered. Just once, just briefly, the way a fastener shudders when load hits it at an angle it wasn't quite expecting, and then it settled. The sealing wrap held. The spring rings held. Cycle 4. From the corner of the lower partition, a sound I had been expecting and did not want to hear, which was the sound of something soft encountering resistance and beginning to apply sustained pressure to that resistance in a very particular way, not impact, not force, but the slow, methodical press of large numbers. The gap was being worked. I estimated 4 minutes before the first units came through. Cycle 5. The coupling was running warm now, warmer than Cycle 1, the thermal load from the surge cycles accumulating. Not in the danger range. Not yet. I had my hand on the housing surface and I was reading the temperature through my palm, the way Cas Auvergne had taught me to read components, not just with instruments but with your hands, because your hands have 30 years of experience at whatever frequency those 30 years have given them, and they know things the instruments miss. My hands told me, holding, warm but holding. Cycle 6. The corner of the partition gave a small sound, a brief, specific sound, a click almost, the sound of a gap widening by another fraction of a millimeter under sustained pressure. I calculated. 3 minutes, possibly 4. Cycle 7. 2 people through, 2 to go. I throttled the airlock drawback by 15% manually, a small reduction within the margin of the airlock's operational tolerance, enough to reduce the surge load on the coupling without extending the cycle time in any way the people cycling through would notice. It was a calculation. Reduce the load on the coupling by a small amount, except a marginally longer cycle time, net the coupling an additional 60 to 90 seconds of service life. It was the right call, I was certain of it. Cycle 8, the last cycle. I heard the coupling not with my ears but with my hand take the surge, hold, settle, hold again. The spring rings were at their limit. I could feel through the housing the difference between a component that was holding within its design parameters and one that was holding because everything that could be done had been done for it and it was giving all of it. The coupling gave all of it. The cycle completed. The indicator light went green. The partition corner gave way. I said to the empty hangar, "Good enough," which is the engineer's highest commendation. It means the work did what was needed. It means whoever comes next will find it done. I want to tell you about what happened in the immediate aftermath, or what I know of it, which is less than what actually happened but more than nothing. The Vreth reached me in approximately 2 minutes after the partition corner opened. What they do to human beings is not something I will describe in detail, partly because the clinical account has been published in the official medical literature if you want it, and partly because what they do is not the point of this story. The point of this story is the pencil, and the 7 numbers, and the relay coupling that held for 12 minutes under emergency surge load, because the sequence drawn on the inside of a cover was correct. The Vreth advance was turned back 14 hours later by a flanking action at the corridor's north boundary. Two compact strike packages that hit the propagation body's rear communication systems and disrupted the collective coordination enough that the Vethnow lost its formation coherence and broke apart. I am not the reason the station survived. I want to be very clear about that. I am the reason 21 specific people reached the staging area and were alive when the station was secured, but the station itself was saved by people I never met, making decisions I wasn't part of, 11 light minutes away. That is how these things usually work. The small acts and the large acts happen simultaneously, in different places, and it is only afterward that you can trace the connection between them. The inquiry, which I have read in full, found the following. The hydraulic actuator seals failed due to resonant frequency fatigue from the Vreth mapping pulse, confirming a known vulnerability not unique to KFS7. The blast partition gaps at the lower corners were a maintenance-deferred item, formally documented, unfunded. The pressure coupling on the south relay was a managed maintenance item, replacement part on order. The jury-rigged repair was within field engineering practice parameters. The evacuation through the secondary airlock was conducted in proper sequence under the senior technical authority present. What the inquiry did not find, because inquiries do not have the language for it, the 7 numbers on the inside of the cover. The inquiry found the coupling and the repair and the outcome. It did not find the reason the repair was possible, which was that someone, years earlier, had looked at a warped seat and worked out the sequence and written it where the next person would see it. That is not in any official record anywhere. It is only in this account, and in the memory of Dale Forst and Pian Noor, who were there, and in whatever understanding has been passed forward from them to the engineers they have trained in the years since. Dale came to see me after my recovery. He sat with me in the quiet place I had moved to, in a room with windows that looked out onto the things I was growing, and we talked for a long time about many things. Toward the end, he told me he had gone back to the relay housing after the station was secured, before the inquiry team arrived. He had opened the cover. "The numbers are still there," he said. "Good," I said. "Do you know who wrote them?" I thought about it honestly. I did not know. There was no way to know. The station records going back 11 years were incomplete. The maintenance logs for the South Relay had been partially overwritten in a records migration 3 years earlier, and even if the original logs had been intact, the kind of pencil notation that goes on the inside of a cover is not the kind of thing that gets entered into a log. It is off-record by nature. That is part of what it is. "No," I said. "Do you want to know?" I thought about that longer, and I understood that I didn't, not because I didn't care about the person, but because knowing would have made it specific in a way that changed what it was. If I knew the name, the sequence became a story about a named person in a named moment. Without the name, the sequence was something larger. It was the practice. It was the habit. It was every human engineer who has ever opened a housing cover and found a mark left for them by someone they would never meet, and every human engineer who has ever put down what they knew where the next person could find it. Knowing the name would have made one person responsible for what was actually the work of many, across many years, in many places, on many pieces of equipment that no one has ever written a word about. "No," I said again, "it doesn't matter who wrote them, it matters that they wrote them." We sat with that for a while. Dale had a cup of tea he had carried in from the kitchen and hadn't touched much. He was that kind of person, would accept hospitality, then forget to use it because he was thinking about something else. A good engineer habit, the tea going cold while you work the problem. He told me after a while about what he had done with the apprentices he was training at the time of the incident and since. He had made it part of the formal induction, not an official requirement, nothing in the curriculum, just a thing he told every new engineer on their first day of substantive work. Before you look at the equipment, look at the inside face of the cover. He told them why. Not the full story. The incident record was restricted during the inquiry period, and he was careful about what he said and to whom. But he told them the principle. He told them about the practice. He told them about the pencil. Some of them thought it was quaint. Some of them asked what the regulation number was for the practice, and when Dale told them there wasn't one, they filed it in the category of things old engineers said that sounded wise but didn't have any formal basis. That's fine. That happens. The practice doesn't require belief to work. It only requires the habit, and the habit comes with time, and time comes with work, and work comes when you stay somewhere long enough to understand what you're staying in. Some of them, Dale said, had already found marks of their own. One had found a corrected calibration value for a sensor array, marked inside the access cover in grease pencil, that turned out to be exactly the correction needed to account for a material's batch variation that the manufacturer had never publicly acknowledged. Another had found a short list of 4-digit numbers, all of them, it turned out, test sequence codes for a diagnostic routine that the official documentation described incorrectly. The correct codes scratched inside the cover by someone who had spent 2 days finding the error before writing down the fix in the most durable place available. Each of them had understood in the moment of finding it what the mark was and why it was there. Each of them had felt something that Dale described as recognition, not surprise, but recognition, the sense of meeting something familiar that you had not known you were waiting for. They're passing it on, Dale said. The ones who found something, I see it in how they open equipment now. I knew what he meant. There is a particular quality to the way an engineer opens a housing cover when they have been trained, properly trained, not by the curriculum but by the practice, to expect that the inside face might tell them something. A slight pause before the cover swings open. A fraction of a second where the attention sharpens. Not everyone does it. And not everyone who does it has found anything yet, but the pause is there, and the pause means the practice is alive. I grow things now in the quiet place. I have a small workshop off the back of the house, the kind of space that accumulates tools over years the way stations accumulate workarounds. Not all at once, but steadily, each tool earning its place by being the right tool for something specific. I do maintenance work on the equipment in the workshop mostly, and on the equipment of the neighbors who have found out that there is a retired directorate engineer in the area who doesn't charge for labor and is available on weekdays. I take the work seriously. I take it seriously in the same way I always have, which is to say, the work is the work. It doesn't change character because the scale changes or the stakes change or the audience changes. A coupling seated correctly in a quiet workshop on a Tuesday afternoon is exactly as correct as a coupling seated correctly in a hangar with the blast partition failing. The correctness is not conditional. The habit is not conditional. That's what the practice means. You do it when no one is watching. You do it when there is no immediate consequence for not doing it. You do it in the small moments and the routine moments, and the moments when doing it carefully costs you time you could spend doing something else. Because the whole point, the only point, is that you cannot know which moment is the one where it matters. You cannot know that in advance. You can only know after which moment it turned out to be. When I open a housing cover, I look at the inside face before I look at anything else. It is automatic now. It has been automatic since Cass O'Verne showed me the first marks, decades ago, and whatever automatic means in practice is that the habit is older than my conscious awareness of it, which is the condition you want for the things that matter most. Twice since I retired I have found marks inside housing covers in my workshop. The first was a note about a ground connection, reversed in the original installation, compensated by a downstream error, the combination producing correct function. The note warning that correcting one without correcting the other would introduce a fault. Precise, specific, and exactly right. I found the downstream error, noted both in my own log and left the original note intact. The second was a single number, written in a corner of the cover in very fine strokes, The kind of mark you make with something small and pointed, like the tip of a compass or a scribe. A date, I think, though I am not entirely certain. A year written in a corner, as if someone had opened the housing and thought, I should leave some record that I was here, that I worked this, that it was examined and found in a certain condition on a certain day. I looked at that date for a long time. I did the math. The mark had been made 19 years before I opened the cover. The person who made it is almost certainly still alive somewhere. I will never know them. They will never know that I found it. They will never know what I thought, standing in my quiet workshop on a Tuesday morning, looking at a number in pencil in a corner of a cover and thinking, I see you. I know what you were doing. I know why you did it. I carry it forward. That is the chain. That is what I mean when I say the habit is older than the conscious awareness of it. It does not require you to understand it completely to practice it, and it does not require you to know the name of every person in the chain to be part of the chain. You open the housing. You look at the inside face. If you found something, you follow it. If you learned something, you write it down. You close the cover. You move on. The chain continues. It has continued since before there were stations, before there were ships, before there was any reason to expect that what you wrote in the dark would ever be read in the light. It continues because the people in it are the kind of people who assume the next person is worth preparing for, and that assumption does not require evidence. It is simply what they do. 7 scratches on the inside of a cover. That's what I followed in Hangar 3 on a Tuesday afternoon, with 300,000 vreth coming through the blast partition gap. 7 scratches that someone wrote for no one in particular, and for everyone who came after. I followed everyone. So should you.